What happens when a judge's gavel clashes with an attorney's unyielding resolve? In a Chicago courtroom, Michael Jordan faced a fine for the simplest of symbols, a gold cross, only to turn the tables on Judge Margaret Evans with a legal showdown no one saw coming. Was this a battle over neutrality, or something far more personal? Step inside the tension, where constitutional rights hung in the balance, and one man's defiance rewrote the rules. Judge Margaret Evans thought she could silence Michael Jordan with a fine. He never expected him to dismantle her entire argument in front of everyone. The courthouse in Chicago, Illinois had seen its fair share of legal battles, but on this particular morning, no one could have predicted the storm that was about to unfold. Michael Jordan, sharp as ever, stepped through the heavy wooden doors, briefcase in one hand, the other adjusting the lapel of his blazer. He was here for what should have been a routine hearing, one he could argue in his sleep. As he made his way to the defendant's table, he felt the judge's eyes on him before she even spoke. Judge Margaret Evans, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor, was staring not at his face, but at something just below his collarbone. A simple gold cross. The air in the courtroom shifted, a quiet stillness. Then, in a tone as sharp as a gavel strike, Evans cleared her throat and leaned forward. "Mr. Jordan, I must remind you that religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." Michael barely blinked. "Your Honor, you're wearing a cross." "That violates the neutrality of the space. You'll need to remove it or face a fine." A murmur rippled through the few spectators in attendance. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The clerk darted a glance at the judge, then back at Michael. This wasn't the first time a judge had tried to assert control over her courtroom in an unusual way, but it was the first time anyone had thought to fine a lawyer over a necklace. Michael didn't move. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but my cross is no different than a wedding ring or a locket with a family photo inside." Judge Margaret Evans's face remained unreadable. "That's not how I see it," she sighed, as if already growing tired of the discussion. "Either remove it, or I'll have to issue a fine for disregarding courtroom neutrality." For the first time in his career, Michael Jordan found himself fined, not for misconduct, not for a procedural violation, but for wearing a piece of jewelry. The fine wasn't the issue. It was what it represented. He didn't take off the cross. Instead, he folded his hands over his briefcase, his expression cool. He wasn't about to let this go. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to address this issue formally." Judge Evans raised a brow. "Address it?" "Yes, I'll be filing an objection, and would like to state my argument on record." The judge smirked, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Mr. Jordan, I'm sure you're aware that this hearing is about a business dispute, not your personal grievances." Michael didn't flinch. "I'm also aware that the First Amendment doesn't take a recess for personal opinions." That got her attention. She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. The room was now on edge, not because of a legal battle over a contract, but because a seasoned attorney had just challenged a judge's authority to her face. Michael knew he was walking a thin line, but backing down wasn't an option. "You're fining me for wearing a cross. Let's break that down legally, shall we?" The judge exhaled, rubbing her temples, but before she could respond, Michael was already reaching into his briefcase. He wasn't just going to argue. He was about to dismantle her entire premise. But Judge Margaret Evans didn't realize just how deep of a hole she had started digging for herself. Michael pulled out a single sheet of paper from his briefcase, placing it carefully on the table in front of him. He didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate. Every second of silence was another tightening of the tension in the room. Judge Evans sighed. "Mr. Jordan, I don't have time for theatrics." Michael didn't blink. "Neither do I, Your Honor, but what I do have is a firm understanding of constitutional law." The judge leaned forward, her fingers laced together, as if bracing for whatever was coming next. "You're fining me for wearing a cross, claiming it violates courtroom neutrality. But tell me, Your Honor, what legal precedent are you basing that on?" The room was silent. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. The bailiff barely shifted in his seat. Judge Evans let out a slow breath. "This courtroom operates under my authority, Mr. Jordan." Michael nodded. "It does, but that authority is not above the Constitution." He tapped the paper in front of him. "And under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected, especially when it does not disrupt proceedings." The judge scoffed. "You're an attorney, not a law professor." Michael smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then let's talk case law, shall we?" He picked up the paper. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969, a landmark case that established that individuals do not shed their constitutional rights when they enter a government institution, whether that's a school or a courtroom. Judge Evans' jaw tightened just slightly. She knew that case. Everyone in the legal field did. Michael didn't stop. West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett, 1943, the Supreme Court ruled that compelling individuals to remove or hide symbols of personal belief is a violation of their First Amendment rights. He set the paper down. "Now, Your Honor, would you like me to keep going, or would you prefer to reconsider that fine?" The judge's fingers tapped against the armrest of her chair. She was cornered, and she knew it, but her pride wouldn't let her concede. Not yet. "This is not a religious debate, Mr. Jordan." Michael tilted his head. "Then why did you make it one?" A few quiet gasps broke out in the courtroom. Judge Evans's face darkened. "Enough." Her voice was sharp, but her authority was slipping. Michael leaned forward, voice steady. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll stop when I receive a legal justification for this fine, because, so far, I haven't heard one." A long pause. The judge finally looked at the clerk. "Mark the fine as pending review." Michael smirked. "I'll take that as a temporary victory." But he wasn't done yet. The real fight was just getting started. Judge Evans' face remained unreadable, but there was no mistaking the way she shifted in her chair. She had expected quiet compliance, not a full-blown constitutional challenge. The air in the courtroom was no longer just tense, it was electric. Michael could feel it. Every set of eyes was glued to him, watching, waiting. He had drawn a line in the sand, and now the judge had two choices: stand by her weak justification and risk humiliation, or find a way to backtrack without losing control. But Evans wasn't one to back down easily. "Mr. Jordan," she began, her tone measured, "courtroom rules exist for a reason. If I allow one form of personal expression, I open the door to all of them." Michael's lips pressed together. "You mean like the wedding bands worn by half the attorneys here? Or the lapel pins you allow on government officials?" Evans's jaw tightened. Michael didn't let up. "Or let's talk about the time you allowed a defense attorney to wear a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness during a trial. You had no issue with that." A few quiet murmurs broke out among the observers. Evans shot a glare toward them, but the damage was already done. Michael had just exposed her selective enforcement. Michael sat back, crossing his arms. "So tell me, Your Honor, why does this rule apply only to my cross?" Evans' fingers curled around the edge of her desk. She was trapped, and everyone in that courtroom could see it. She had enforced an unwritten rule based on personal bias, and now it was crumbling beneath her. For the first time since the hearing began, she didn't have a response. Michael didn't need to gloat. He just let the silence stretch long enough for everyone to absorb the reality of the situation. Then he delivered the final blow. "If you stand by this fine, Your Honor, I will be filing an appeal before the ink dries on the ruling, and when that happens, I guarantee this case will make headlines." He let that sink in. A sitting judge fining a man for wearing a cross in court. I'm sure the higher courts would love to weigh in on that precedent. Evans's nostrils flared. Her ego and pride were fighting a war against cold, hard reality. Michael didn't look away. He let her sit with it. The longer she delayed, the more obvious her mistake became. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled sharply. "The fine is rescinded," she muttered. Michael smiled. "Much appreciated, Your Honor." But this wasn't just about a fine anymore. He had just sent a message loud and clear, one that Evans wouldn't forget anytime soon. But the fallout, that was only just beginning. The judge's words, "The fine is rescinded," should have ended it. But the courtroom was no longer just a legal battleground. It was a spectacle, and everyone present had just witnessed something they weren't likely to forget. The court reporter barely looked up from her keyboard, but even she knew this transcript would circulate beyond this room. The clerk, who had initially looked uneasy when the fine was announced, now stole a quick glance at Michael, almost as if impressed. Judge Evans shifted in her chair, straightening her papers as if she could physically erase the moment. But Michael knew better. This wasn't something she could brush aside. The silence was deafening. Michael calmly adjusted his blazer, the small gold cross still in place, exactly where it had been the entire time. He had won, but now he needed to make sure this wasn't just a personal victory. It had to mean something more. He turned to his client, a middle-aged business owner who had been the actual reason for this hearing. The man gave him a barely concealed nod of respect, his confidence in him only growing stronger. Michael knew this wasn't just about him anymore. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. A reporter, one who had been covering an entirely different case in the same building, caught wind of what had just unfolded. Within an hour, a local news website had posted the headline, "Illinois judge attempts to fine attorney for wearing a cross, but it doesn't go as planned." Michael's phone buzzed, then again and again. Colleagues, former law school classmates, journalists. People wanted to know what had just happened. But Michael wasn't interested in headlines or media spins. He had a bigger picture in mind. His next step, taking this case beyond just one courtroom skirmish. He wasn't naive. He knew that cases like these had ripple effects, whether he intended them to or not. This wasn't just about a single judge and a single attorney anymore. This was a challenge to a precedent that hadn't yet been set, but very well could be. Would other judges attempt something similar? Would attorneys feel pressured to leave their personal symbols at home to avoid confrontation? Would this moment embolden others to push the boundaries of courtroom neutrality in ways that targeted personal beliefs? Michael wasn't going to let that happen. By that evening, the story had already taken on a life of its own. A well-known legal commentator on a conservative news station brought it up during a panel discussion. On social media, heated debates broke out between those who supported the judge's stance and those who saw Michael's defiance as an important stand for constitutional rights. Michael sat in his office, watching the discussion unfold on his phone. A producer from a national news network had already reached out, requesting an interview. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. He had spent years fighting for clients, standing his ground in high-stakes cases. But this felt different. This wasn't about corporate disputes or criminal defenses. This was about personal freedoms and whether they could be stripped away on the whim of a single judge. But Judge Evans wasn't done with him yet. He could sense it. Even as he left the courthouse that day, the way she had looked at him before banging the gavel and dismissing the session. He might have rescinded the fine, but there had been something in her expression. An unspoken challenge. Michael wasn't sure what form it would take, but he knew this battle was far from over. Michael had expected some fallout, a few emails, maybe a couple of phone calls from colleagues weighing in. What he hadn't expected was the sheer speed at which everything escalated. By the time he walked into his office the next morning, his assistant, Sarah, was already waiting with a concerned expression. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. Michael took it, scanning the screen. The Illinois Bar Association had just issued a statement, carefully worded, neutral in tone, but unmistakable in its implications. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded personal expression, It is important to respect the roles set forth by presiding judges. We trust our judicial system to navigate these matters with fairness and integrity. Michael let out a slow breath. This wasn't just a comment. This was a warning. The words, "Respect the roles set forth by presiding judges," weren't just a general statement. It was a signal. The legal world was tight-knit. The Illinois bar rarely commented on courtroom disputes unless they had reason to believe a situation was getting out of hand. This meant Evans wasn't just bitter. She was already working behind the scenes to rally institutional backing. He set the tablet down. "This came out today?" Sarah nodded. "An hour ago." Michael wasn't surprised. The legal community was small, word had traveled fast, and Evans clearly wasn't taking this lightly. But before he could say another word, Sarah hesitated. "There's more," she said carefully. Michael glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Go on." Sarah handed him another document, this one printed. Michael skimmed the first few lines, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. Attorney Michael Jordan conducted himself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. Michael couldn't help it. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Unbecoming?" He shook his head. "That's rich." Sarah sighed. "It's retaliation, pure and simple." Michael leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest. Evans wasn't just looking for payback. She was trying to set an example. He had lost in her own courtroom, and now she was using the system to reassert her power. By filing this formal complaint, she was trying to flip the narrative. She was no longer the judge who overstepped her authority. She was painting herself as the one who had been disrespected. And Michael, he wanted to make him look like the reckless attorney who had challenged her just for the sake of challenging her. Michael had seen this move before. It was a common tactic. Turn the accuser into the accused, reframe the story so the real issue got buried beneath bureaucracy and technicalities. But he wasn't about to let that happen. "What's the process on this?" he asked, already shifting gears. Sarah exhaled. "You'll have to respond within 10 days. If the complaint moves forward, they could conduct a formal review." Michael nodded slowly. "And who oversees that review?" Sarah hesitated. "A panel that includes judges and senior attorneys." Michael almost smiled. If Evans was hoping to bury him in paperwork and quiet pressure, she had miscalculated, because this wasn't going to be handled quietly. This was about to become very public. Sarah studied him, waiting for his reaction. "What do you want to do?" Michael took a deep breath, then reached for his phone. "If Evans wants to play games, let's play." He scrolled through his contacts, his mind already 10 steps ahead. Evans thought he was going to defend himself in a closed-door hearing, accept a quiet reprimand and move on, but she didn't understand who she was dealing with. Michael had spent his career playing the long game, and now he was about to make sure everyone was watching. Michael didn't waste time. He knew how these things worked. Retaliation was most effective when it happened in the shadows. Evans wanted to handle this quietly, using the system against him while keeping the public in the dark. He wasn't about to let that happen. He scrolled through his phone, found the contact he needed, and pressed call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Michael, I was just about to call you." It was Emily Carter, a veteran journalist from a national legal affairs program. She had covered some of Michael's biggest cases before, and, more importantly, she wasn't afraid to go after judicial overreach. Michael got straight to the point. "Emily, I need you to listen carefully. A judge just filed a formal complaint against me for disrupting courtroom proceedings. But what really happened? She tried to fine me for wearing a cross, and when I stood my ground, she backed down. But now she's using the system to punish me instead." Emily was silent for a moment. Then she let out a sharp breath. "You're telling me a sitting judge is trying to sanction you because you called out her abuse of power?" Michael smiled. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Emily didn't hesitate. I'm running this. Michael leaned forward. I need it on record before they try to spin it. Once it's public, Evans won't be able to twist this into a quiet, disciplinary issue. Emily was already on it. I'll have a segment up by tomorrow, and I'll make sure legal analysts weigh in, especially ones who won't be afraid to call this out for what it is. Michael hung up, feeling the first stirrings of momentum shifting in his favor. But he wasn't done yet. He turned back to Sarah. Draft a public statement. I want to make my position clear before Evans and her allies try to muddy the waters. Sarah nodded. You want to frame this as judicial overreach? Michael shook his head. I want to frame it as exactly what it is, an attack on personal rights and an abuse of judicial power. If this judge thinks she can punish me for standing up for myself, imagine what she's done to people who don't have a platform. Sarah's expression hardened. I'll get it done. Michael exhaled, gathering his thoughts. Evans had been counting on silence, but now the country was about to find out exactly what she had done. Michael didn't have to wait long. By the time he sat down with his coffee the next morning, his phone was already buzzing non-stop. News outlets had picked up Emily Carter's segment overnight, and social media was ablaze. The headline was everywhere. Illinois judge attempts to punish attorney for wearing a cross. Now she's under fire. It wasn't just conservative outlets running the story. Legal analysts across the board, left, right, and center, were weighing in. A constitutional lawyer from Georgetown went on live television to tear Evans's logic apart, calling it a blatant overreach that has no legal standing. Another high-profile attorney posted a thread dissecting how Michael's actions had exposed a dangerous precedent that needed to be addressed. And then came the statement Michael had been waiting for. The Illinois Judicial Review Board announced that, due to the media attention, they would be reviewing Judge Evans's conduct to determine whether her ruling had violated judicial ethics. Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaling. This was no longer just about him. This was about every attorney, every defendant, every person who had ever stepped into a courtroom wondering whether their rights could be stripped away with a stroke of a judge's pen. Sarah walked in, holding up her phone. You're going to want to see this. Michael took it and pressed play. It was Evans. She was standing outside the courthouse, cameras flashing around her, her expression stiff. The statement was short. Too short for someone trying to defend herself. I have always upheld the integrity of this courtroom. The actions taken were in the interest of maintaining neutrality. However, I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully. Michael almost laughed. Neutrality, he said. She was still trying to play that card. Sarah crossed her arms. She's trying to save face. Michael nodded. And failing. Because this wasn't going away. The Judicial Review Board had a decision to make. If they ruled against Evans, it wouldn't just be a professional embarrassment, it would set a precedent, one that protected people like Michael from ever facing this kind of retaliation. Again. But even if they didn't formally reprimand her, she had already lost where it mattered most, her reputation, her credibility, her authority, because after this, every attorney who walked into her courtroom would know this was the judge who tried to silence someone and lost. Michael took a slow sip of his coffee, then looked up at Sarah. We won, Sarah smirked. Oh, I know. Michael set his cup down. He hadn't just fought for himself. He had sent a message. Never let someone in power strip away your rights without a fight, because sometimes all it takes is one person standing their ground to change everything. If you believe in standing up for your rights, make sure your voice is heard. Like, comment, and subscribe for more real stories that matter.